October 6th, 1986. The date in which theorists were thrown into chaos. The enigmatic Rokenjima incident would grow from beyond the remote island into the world of conspiracy. Even 12 years later, discussion and theories of such an event are commonplace. Nonetheless, the many years of scrounging for evidence have amounted to nothing in the end. All that is known is the backstory and result. The in-between beginning October 4th and ending at midnight on October 5th, however, is blurred. The only evidence that exists is hidden inside the cat box of the few that made it out, and the original messages sent afloat by the culprit. In between these many contradicting tales found at sea, lack of physical evidence and interference from theory hunters, what truth could have been found is all muddled. In the end, no one knows. The lingering questions of what could have happened on the island of Rokenjima, who or what is the culprit, how was it done, and their motive? Those questions without answers are entirely interpretive. From an observer's point of view, what is detailed both inside and outside of Beatrice's tales, from chronology to the authenticity of events, none of it is clear. It's safe to say that a majority, well over half of what is inscribed, is mere illusions. The truth is far from revealed. Through hints stacked upon hints veiled in magic, shows an outline, but not many, if anyone, has found it. The undiscovered is of great interest to people on an instinctual level. Bizarre occurrences that can't be explained with a glance entice the curious to gaze. If such a situation were to happen to a prominent group whose accolades are already a mystery, well, that would be twice as alluring. When one is faced with the unknown, they grasp onto what little info there is, building atop that foundation with their own theory, leading a majority to believe that the sole survivor of an infamous massacre to have been the one behind it all. That, of course, is absurd to the few who know her. It is often said, without love it cannot be seen, and that is where empathy and personal belief is important. Knowing the heart can simultaneously close and open doors. Paths to the truth may not be followed without it. Yet, if the answer were to be too painful, the correct path may be pruned to an individual. Such a contradiction lies in Angie Ushiromiya's heart, who for 12 years has grieved over her family's supposed deaths. She desperately wanted to know the truth, for the infinitesimal chance of her wish coming to light. However, opening the box would solidify the despair hidden inside. But as long as the lid stayed closed, if nothing were to deny her dreams, that hope would live. As long as she was ignorant, she could hide behind the shield of gold, proclaiming her family is still alive. As much as we believe that truth is unified for humans, it differs between individuals. There are many who accept fiction as a part of the world, and between each one resides varied reasons for such. This relationship one can have by merging the reality with fiction can be both symbiotic and parasitic. A lone 9-year-old girl, Ushiromiya, is of the former. From her physically and emotionally abusive mother to lack of father figure, her reality, her truth is awfully grim. Chastised for her eccentric behavior and outcasted for things beyond her control, she grasped that dangling opportunity for happiness. She lived in delusions of grandeur, not to hide from the darkness that lurked in her world, but to bring light herself. This obsession with magic may have caused her to stray further from a social standpoint, but by living in her land of make-believe, she could make even the darkest days shine. Through this escapism, she was able to find true happiness. Ironically enough, the one who bolstered her confidence in this world was on the opposite end of the spectrum. Maria used escapism to help accept her circumstances. While at first Beatrice or Yasu used it to break free from the mundane, it eventually became a means to run away. The circumstances regarding her birth were shrouded in misfortune, leaving both mental and physical scars that would never heal. Growing through childhood, the pieces missing that would make someone complete were too great, ultimately giving her a loose sense of identity, with her deciding to fill that void not by working towards becoming a better person, but by becoming someone else. Slowly, as the beautiful experiences of youth found her, the conflict between her wants, beliefs, and capabilities arose. With the scars and the revelation regarding her birth escalating this fester of negative emotions. Love, happiness, self had an ideal image in her mind. However, with who she was, capturing these concepts in the form of her ideals was impossible. She found this to be a darkness she couldn't escape from, deciding to immerse herself in her roles even further. When the pain was too much, she transferred it to another. But no matter how much she jumped to her personas, the baggage inside of her heart remained. While she shut herself in her room playing to her heart's content, the darkness continued to loom outside. At some point, it became overwhelming, forcing her to submit, leading to a most unfortunate tragedy. Becoming the Golden Witch gave her the only sense of purpose, and by fulfilling the conditions for her revival, met the end of her suffering, and allowed her to escape the regret, guilt, and shame. Kinzo had abused escapism as well, but as a process to cope and grieve for his sins. Not to help accept his circumstances, but to deny the inevitable parting of the one who had given him life and purpose. The death of his beloved led to a lapse in judgment more than a few times. There were moments where he truly convinced himself that it wasn't his daughter, but the rebirth of his wife. This was the easiest truth he could latch onto, and as the girl grew and bore a greater resemblance to her late mother, Kinzo committed acts he would only regret. His rationality would show itself, letting his consciousness drag him to the depths with grief, yet still held on to the occult in hopes to bring his fantasy to life. Time proceeded, and the more he repented for all he had done, he gradually grew a clear conscience. However, the untimely demise of not one, but two offspring led him to immerse himself in despair once again. A despair so great he twisted his perception of all things and sold them as truth. When the Grand Sorcerer Goldsmith, he pours his efforts into Beatrice's revival, but when Kinzo, he truly, sincerely yearns to apologize for all he has done. Then we have Angie, who teeters along both sides. Following Maria's influence of having a healthy relationship, she uses the concept to push herself forward at her lowest points in life, using it to lighten the weights of her loneliness and ease her heart. But in the moments where her reliance on it comes to the point of abuse, its lack of effect it has on reality forces her to use logic and rationale to reject it altogether. Yet, it's just a flame that has been reduced to an ember, waiting to be set ablaze once again. Without empathy, Maria seems like a weird eccentric, Beatrice a mere illusion, or if taken to be real, a psychopathic murderer, Kinzo a delusional madman who only wants to revive his dead lover, and Angie a moody teen whose position and unsociable air seem suspicious, arrogant, and a bit odd. Just like they changed their truth of the world, that act is enough to have the truth regarding them change to people who refuse to take the path of understanding. The reasons for one's actions, or the reason for one becoming the way they are, is often left void in public eyes. One by one, this sentiment has hazed the Ushiromiya's reputation. Natsuhi, whose pride has been dragged through the dirt by circumstances beyond her control, where all it took was an extra nudge to push herself into sin. Kraus, hiding the family head's death, not to amass money selfishly, but to avoid any complications for his family. Eva, pushed to the emotional limit after having witnessed the deaths of her beloved husband and son, then not only returned to be accused of such horrific crimes, but be rejected again and again by the only other person she could call family. We see Rosa, a mother whose love is often clouded by using Maria as an outlet to vent her stress and troubles. This behavior pains her, but the more she tries to make up for her incapability, the more she finds herself wallowing in hedonistic activities due to her unfulfilled desires. On the outside, she's despicable, but deep down, she truly wants to show the requited love to her daughter. A majority of the siblings' despair and current character all derive from the actions of Kinzo, who, as a father, was the lowest of the low. But being forced to live a life you hate against your own will would break anyone. He was a puppet, holding apathy for all things he didn't choose himself, including his arranged marriage and his children shortly after. His neglect didn't arise from sheer despicable emotions of selfishness, but because the need to escape to a life he built himself was the only thing that made him feel alive. However, their humanity behind their actions is often disregarded, with not a thought as to why. To this uncanny family, an immoral or incorrect action is not taken as a mistake, nor as a person who's been pushed to their limits, but as a direct reflection of their true selves, twisting their characters into mere caricatures for their own enjoyment. Without one clear truth, one ignorant truth influences another, until they all become jumbled into an incoherent mess, letting those who know and those who are ignorant of the person have two completely different truths regarding them. Angie herself had completely forgotten the true sides to nearly all of her family. The caring aunts were vicious, the affable uncles became desperate, selfish businessmen. Her jolly grandfather was overwritten with dictator-like air and authority. And while some of that may remain true to an extent, all of them had been tainted in young Angie's mind by the public bias, letting the exaggeration of their worst qualities become the truth. For those who have witnessed the 8 tales see all different sides to each person. The family's regrets, guilt, and shame towards all the horrible acts they may have committed is apparent. And it's only when each piece comes together can you see a complete puzzle that opens the door to the full truth. The same can apply not just to the Ushiromiya, but to anyone. Humans, obviously, aren't perfect, and there may be a situation that hits the one flaw in someone's mental defenses, causing them to break. Littered throughout the stories of many more, dispel the thought of judgment solely between good and evil. It's not about forgiveness or redeeming one's sin, but coming to understand why they were made. Whether one chooses to empathize or not, can alter their own perception, alter their own truth. Without trying to comprehend another, the ones who commit the taboo are no better than demons, but nobody is capable of always making the correct choice. People have their own minds that are easily led astray by the influences around them. or the one inside themselves. How one thinks, processes that information, then speaks about it differs, with thousands of methods to do so, some being more harmful than others. That's why truly understanding someone is beyond the bounds of possibility, such that an innocuous act or dialogue can lead to added weights on their shoulders. Then, as the weight crumbles the foundation beneath it, not even the one in question knows how they will react. That's why, in the depths of everyone's core, lies a truth of hardship unbeknownst to everyone else. But as long as there's an attempt to understand, no matter how weird or demonic in nature their actions are, with love, their humanity can be seen. That is what it means to interpret truth with empathy. All the possibilities, both the dark and the light in human hearts, can only be perceived in full by those who transcend their own world and become an onlooker of multiple realities, leaving those to the limited perspective of one outcome to use only what they know. But when their reality is clouded by another's fantasy, discerning and picking apart the two proves to be challenging. Each and every piece, every scene, can have multiple ways it can be interpreted. This convoluted outlook is all thanks to the meta world, a realm in which witches and other worldly beings wander between the fragments of the greater universe. Whether or not this realm truly exists is debatable. Nonetheless, remains one of the three major settings alongside the 1986 game board, or the 1986 Forgeries to those of the mortal plane, and the world of 1998. We, the readers, start off in the middle, being introduced to the soon-to-be victims. Get to know the basis of the family story. Then, as they are picked off and the legend of the Golden Witch reaches its climax, when the belief of the witch is at its highest, the meta element kicks in. Just like Beatrice is to Battler, the author is trying to persuade the reader into believing in the story's magic. Then, after a rondo of wits between the two, the third element comes into play, the after story. The result of everything and the story of Angie's depression and how the uncertainty of that event has led to constant brooding to both survivors. The readers see not only how this event has impacted the world at large, but how the victims feel at the world's reaction. That's when the aspect of reality seeps in, letting the reader know how that spectacle of fiction versus truth never really mattered in the grand scheme of things. It serves to disconnect the three settings, instead of having them neatly joined together, in terms of tone at least. The story within the game board becomes a thrilling fantasy-tinted mystery. The meta becomes an adrenaline-pumping thinking game, and the future shows a depressing result that has been hidden by the previous two. However, this meta element weaves all three, foregoing the reality and making it a world conjoined by the supernatural. That is when the true game of thought begins. The multi-layered narrative is a mixture on the brink of a solution. Lying firmly in between the two, you can't simply separate each ingredient and rearrange the story to fit neatly, as two or even all three of the settings intermittently overlap. The only way to have each part neatly detached from one another may be to change the scene's very foundation, stretching your thought as far as possible just to get somewhat close to an accurate interpretation. However, due to the lack of information, knowing whether it was right or not is impossible to say with certainty. Yet likewise, is also impossible to disprove. The closest to reality is Angie's story. Despite this, while in her perspective, surroundings may warp, a new acquaintance may take the form of a god, a mysterious being may be floating in front of her, In every scene glossed in the supernatural, hidden inside this fantasy is a cipher for reality. Are these occurrences just so the author can make the story more confusing? Are the appearances of such unusual characters a metaphor? Or is this simply the truth? All three are viable. However, the perspective that can ground every fantastical segment leaves much room for discussion. A recurring scene throughout has a lonely Angie seen to be on a rooftop, gazing at the city below. It is here a witch appears in front of her, leading to 3 different outcomes. The first is shown in chapter 3, after Eva's death. This scene, Angie is void, contemplating her circumstances while wishing to have the truth of that day. She isn't in distress, but emptily follows the witch in front of her, taking her time before falling. Taking Bern Castell as Angie's manifestation of thought shows that Angie is still meandering between her hopes and desire for the truth. She hesitated to take that jump, possibly allowing for the Ushiromiya group to set up safety measures. Or she didn't jump at all, and it was a metaphor for her leap into a new train of thought that would lead her to a separate outcome. The next outcome, shown in chapters 7 and 8, is the most grim. It was this scene where Angie was in complete distress, overwhelmed with emotion by the fact that the real truth is the most devastating one. This bout of emotion could have come from having access to Eva's diary, and knowing left no hope for her. The witch, her own insistence, drove those negative thoughts into her mind, and without hesitation ended her suffering. To contrast, the third and final outcome is the conclusion of chapter 8 with a positive, empathetic Angie, where instead of thinking purely of her own circumstances, thought of what her family would have wanted for her. It was this instance where written all across her face was contentment. No dark or empty feelings, but an acceptance of the past and a goal for the future. How long she pondered, or the differences in her actions before this point, are unknown. Even knowing if the previous 2 results had any connection to what is shown here is all debatable. Perhaps that jump was the start of her long mental journey of sorting out her feelings. Maybe the second outcome is not a reality at all, and was just the ploy set up by Angie as a way to cut all ties with her old life. And those are only a few of many possibilities regarding this one instance, where 1998 and the meta realm merged. So then, how about an example in which all 3 settings take place simultaneously? Chapter 6 features a discussion between Angie and author Ikuko Hachijo regarding the forgeries of the Rokenjima incident, when suddenly the world shifts. Instead of her new work, when Hachijo takes the appearance of Featherine, their conversation shifts to the game board and its contestants, swapping between and overlaying one over another. Through layer upon layer, the change in atmosphere is able to convey 4 separate storylines as one. First, the game board. Second, the discussion between the players. Third, Angie and Featherine commentating over their game as a metaphor for 4. Angie and Ikuko's discussion of her new work, Dawn of the Golden Witch. Very subtly can pieces be rearranged to separate each realm, with the jargon between the 2 overseers being major. As the world around them changes, it is no longer Hachijo the writer, but Battler the game master. It is no longer the tale Dawn of the Golden Witch, but Game 6.
Dawn.
To Angie and Hachijo, it's known as the message bottles, but when Featherine appears, they are referred to as Battler and Beatrice's games. These innocent sayings, when taken in a different light, are major hints to sever the multiple storylines. The very foundation for the entire story is shrouded in obscurity. It makes you question, what is reality? What is fiction? The many interpretations of the Rokenjima incident are shown as a game between those in the plane above, but more interestingly, an allegory in the world of the living. The reasoning behind the former is bluntly stated, but if you take the Rokenjima happenings as the latter, then that births two questions. Who wrote them, and for what purpose? The first two, Legend and Turn of the Golden Witch, are heavily implied to be the only two bottles written by the person behind the illusion of Beatrice. With Banquet, Alliance, End, and Dawn, all inferred to be written by the Hachijo duo given Angie's talk with Ikuko in Chapter 6. The important thing is to keep in mind of Toya. After all, he is the only other survivor who is aware of how gruesome that day was. However, just like everyone else, the truth was far from his grasp, and like the majority, could only come to a conclusion based on the outcome. And so, for what reason did he contribute to the forgeries? What was from his mind, and what was from Ikuko's? What was the purpose of creating those four tales? It's not stated. However, like everything else, the truth hides in between the gaps of fiction. Twilight of the Golden Witch, using the message of the story as a base, could also be seen as a work of Toya, given his feelings towards Angie and her being the center of the story. Requiem is the most ambiguous. It blurs the lines even further, as the information presented through Will's questioning brings the debate of how the original author knew. Kinzo's story is something he took to the grave, with very few knowledgeable of his past. But if Will's involvement is seen as a tale being tampered with by the meta, and if all of it were to be removed, it simply tells of Beatrice's funeral. And as said in Requiem, funerals aren't for the dead. They exist so that those who are alive can sever their ties with the dead. With this piece possibly being the author's way to cut their own ties to the character behind Beatrice. And though this topic of interpretation usually only arrives when both magic and reality intermix, but even if one does not overlap with the other, truth can still be discussed. Just take a look at the residents of the meta world, witches and furniture alike. They can easily be seen akin to alter egos or concepts given form, ranging from both obvious to obscure original identities. First, you have Beatrice's group, whose vessels are quite easy to draw the lines between, basing themselves off of Sayo and the few close to her. Kumasawa is Virgilia's vessel given her motherly mentor role in Sayo's life. Then Genji Ronoe as Ronoe, given their name and loyal servant role. Then through process of elimination can surmise Nanjo as Gap. Although the physical difference is a lot more drastic in nature, the relation can be explained with Gap's ability of teleportation. As Nanjo is the only one who confirms the deaths that take place, it can make it seem like people who are thought to be dead have been moved afterwards. But if everyone alive has an alibi, it creates a gap in logic as nobody could have moved them. Then we have the furniture, the Seven Sisters of Purgatory and Siester Sisters being based off of Kinzo's stakes and Maria's band of toy rabbits. Moving on from the Rokenjima group, instead of a person per se, the clergy can be seen as a representative of the rules binding classic mystery stories. Delanor being Nox's Decalogue, and Will being the rules of Van Dyne given their names. But what is also interesting is how those familiar with the previous When They Cry title, Higurashi no Naku Koro ni, will perceive certain characters differently, pertaining to the voyaging duo, Bern and Lambda Delta. The former being the easier of the two to see through. Readers of Higurashi see a spitting image of Rika Furude, given the long blue hair and the use of one of her signature phrases. with Higurashi Ide detailing the meaning and reasoning for her adopting the name Frederica Bernkastel. This alter ego that appears before us gives us a sense of comfort in her character, despite her emotionless demeanor. We've seen her true self, seen her overcome her own adversity, and grew attached to her character. As such, trusted her to be a dependable ally for Battler and Angie, that people unfamiliar with Bernkastel's origin likely won't have. On the other hand, Lambda's personality, etymology, appearance, and backstory could be split between Rika's enemy, Mio Takano, or her dear friend Satoko Hojo. From her first appearance, played to both sides. The short blonde hair is a point for both, with her mannerisms and affection for Bernkastel tipping the scale towards Satoko's side. However, a quote from Bernkastel seems to be concrete evidence towards the former.
白状する。今のあなたは、かつてラムダの世界に囚われていた頃の私にそっくりなの。過酷な運命の迷路に閉じ込められ、魔女にいいようにいたぶられている。私はそこから生まれた魔女。
But later dialogue from Lambda and Bern contradicts the Takano theory. In Twilight of the Golden Witch, Lambda brings up a riddle that was told to her in the past, with Bernkastel replying that she was stumped when she had first heard it. Oddly enough, the same riddle was told to Satoko by a close friend to distract her. One other point towards Takano's side was the correlation between the names of the two. Her given name, Mio, when separated, makes for a form of Japanese counting, Mi being 3 and Yo being 4. While similarly, Lambda Delta can be split up into Greek numerals, with Lambda being 30 and Delta 4. A small detail that often goes unnoticed, but served to add on the confusion to her origin, leaving the question, who is Lambda Delta, for the readers to ponder. Then the final witch to be unveiled is the one of truth, Erika Fururo, who, while as a piece of Bernkastel, could also fit in Angie, who took a different path. The Angie who fell victim to the plague of inquisitiveness, seeking the truth and nothing else. Such thoughts derive from when Angie figured out Amakusa's plan in an alternate fragment, and in the last note chapter, in her game with peace, where when she's seen through the tricks directed at her, Erika appeared alongside her, foregoing them being just a role in the story. As said before, the witches could all be seen as a form of a real-world character's mental internalization, in which Bernkastel is Angie's own negative emotions, seen to guide her to despair when she declares her rejection for Eva and the aforementioned rooftop scene, while Erika is her desire for the truth. And in following that line of thought, Lord Battler could be her hope, leading her to a more positive outlook on her situation. The entirety of Chapter 8 was Angie coming to accept the past for what it is, and moving on with her life in a way that both she and her family would have wanted. Throughout all of this, she was guided by Battler. Meanwhile, Lambda can be seen as Sayo Yasuda's internalization, where Lambda only appears once Yasu is certain of this new path she will take. From the infrastructure the story is built upon, from setting, dialogue, characters, and events, there is always more than one way to interpret the truth behind it. As within this single tale of authors laying their feelings bare through writing, branches into multiple stories that when put together can be perceived differently. Not everyone will come out of it and have the same understanding of what they have just witnessed. There could be hundreds, thousands of ways people have interpreted the story, and that is what makes this a beautiful experience. From the representation of witches and magic, the debate of their existence and integration in reality, to what happened on October 4th and 5th, 1986, none of it is clear, as some things are left unanswered for a reason. Of course, what we readers are shown could be the truth of how these events unfolded. Maybe there is no secrets and all of this fantastical stuff exists. But even so, this overlap in stories create walls that guide our thoughts to many doors, allowing us to pick apart and do with the information as we please. Whether you take it at face value or decide to filter the so-called fantasy from reality, it's ultimately up to you. Facts are just an outline for the truth, so when there isn't enough to keep the truth on track, it can branch too many and be left equivocal. In the end, it's up to the individual to come to a conclusion. However, one important thing to keep in mind is the heart. While multiple truths can exist within facts, a vague and often obscure factor can prove to be even more vital. That being the motive behind it all. Just because you can tear down an illusion, it's best to keep in mind why it exists in the first place. Skewing the facts to fit your negative prejudice can end up no greater than slander, and unbeknownst to you, can hurt those on the receiving end. Many things are not at all clear-cut, but don't be so narrowed in on a singular truth when other, more logical and fair truths exist. Empathy should be a factor as a way to keep your truth from harming others, and maybe looking at it with the perspective of love can guide your thoughts in a more meaningful direction. As without love, the truth cannot be seen.